I explained in the last video that if you had this part of the quilt assembled, you would be able to learn how to stitch down the sashes. I just want to say, normally the remaining 2 quilt blocks would be attached before I took this step, but I want to be able to provide you with the opportunity to try something and learn it, even if you're not as far as I would normally be. Before turning the sashes towards the center and stitching them in place, I make sure the quilt block I'm going to be sewing is attached to every quilt block it's going to be attached to when the project is completed. In other words, this quilt block is attached to the center and 2 sides, so it's a good candidate for turning the sashes over, as well as this one. These 3 are not ready yet because they haven't been attached to the other quilt pieces that will go down at the bottom. But I can demonstrate how to turn over the sashes now on these pieces, so that's what I'm going to do. Each hexagon or honeycomb quilt block has 6 of these V-shaped areas cut into it. I call one side a leg and I call the other side a leg, and I don't distinguish. What I will tell you is, when you stitch down a sash on a honeycomb quilt, one leg is always folded to the turn to line. I'm going to put a pin in that. So one leg's folded to the turn to line. That's one of those black lines we put on either side of the V. And the other side, which is not turned under, is left flat as the piece is being assembled. When that happens, you can simply fold the folded leg over top of the flat leg and stitch it in place, and that will make that beveled edge. One thing that's distinctive about the quilt blocks that I can turn under is that 3 of their edges are attached to a neighboring quilt block, and 2 of the edges are floating out in space, so to speak. And so I personally like to simplify turning these under. These turn to lines are basically there to guide you when turning the fabric where the turn should end. They do not relate to the stitching line. The stitching line is 1/4 inch from the edge. So what I will do is I'll fold these pieces right sides together, and using a basting stitch with no back stitching, I'll hold them in place. Once these beveled edges that have been basted in place are turned over, it's time to install the centerpiece and sew the rest of the sashes down. I like to start sewing my sashes on a sash that's attached to another quilt block, and I start sewing halfway down. I'm going to use this blue marker to show you how I usually stitch. I usually start in the middle and head towards one of the beveled edges. Now I'm going to slide a piece of fabric underneath this one beveled edge that I'm going to be working on, so that you can distinguish the area that I'm going to work on, and hopefully it won't be as confused with other areas. You notice as you approach the beveled edge, one leg of the sash stays flat. The other leg gets a fold in it that's almost automatic. You take the folded side of that piece of fabric and you sit it on top of the flat piece of fabric that is one leg of the beveled edge. Now, what I usually do is I usually don't have pins at my sewing machine, so I usually sew down here. I stop at the junction of the 2 sashes, and I sew down. You can choose to pivot, but I prefer to backstitch, and in a little while I'll tell you why. So I backstitch, trying to land my stitches on the previous stitches, and then I head this way towards my next beveled edge. Again, I'm going to fold the piece, the first leg, so it's flat. I'm going to fold the second leg, the remaining leg, so to speak, so that it's folded towards the 2 fold line. Then I'm going to flip it up, make sure it intersects nicely with the previous sash, and I'm going to plant my needle right here and stop. I'm going to look at this area. I'm going to take my paint dropper, and if this isn't the way I want it to look, I just tidy it up and straighten it out. So you can pull out a little fabric with the ball, or you can hold it in place as you sew. You can even force a little bit of fabric towards the middle of the quilt piece using either a stiletto or a paint dropper. And so that way you can even out your beveled edge and make it look as nice as possible. Once I've got it looking good, I stitch down, and I personally back stitch and head towards my next beveled edge, where I'm going to do the same thing. The pins just represent my stitching line. You would think this part's going to be easy because these are pre-stitched, but actually this is where I sometimes get into a little trouble, so I just want to outline something that I do. The first thing I do is I make sure all the seam allowances that are here are turned in the same direction as the previous seam allowances. Here's my right hand. All these seam allowances at the beveled edges are all turned to the right, so I'm going to do that with this. Then I hold it down and I look at it. Remember, my needle's planted over here. I see that the depth of this sash has decreased and is gradually decreasing as I approach my pre-sewn beveled edge. I don't want that. So what I do is I yank my sash into the position I do like, and frequently I'll hold it there with a stiletto, and then I sew to close to the beveled edge, the pre-sewn beveled edge, and I stop. Then I take the sash that's next to it and fold it so that I think it looks very nice too. And when I've got them intersecting very nicely, what I'll do is I'll stitch, plant my needle, and then I'll observe this beveled edge, and I'll tidy it up with my paint pusher again. This is where stitching down and back stitching is really useful. It is possible to stitch down, hold your fabric here, plant your needle, and pivot, but frequently if you do that, your presser foot's hanging out in space, and when that happens, you'll end up getting at least skip stitches and sometimes broken needles because the presser foot ends up on an angle, and the angle can cause the needle to hit the presser foot, and the presser foot can, it can stop everything, and you'll need a new needle. This is why backstitch. If you're not going to backstitch, if you're going to plant, pivot, and go the other direction, it's a good idea to use a button reed. Once you've backstitched or used a button reed to go back, you plant your needle here, pivot, and head towards your second pre-sewn beveled edge. Make sure all of the seam allowances are turned the same direction as your previous beveled edge. Mine happen to be turned to the right. Make sure you like the depth of the sash and continue to sew. Once you begin to approach this beveled edge, you'll see why I started sewing in the middle. I'm going to take this piece, I've got to fold it, and then I have to fold the last piece on top of it and stitch it down and back. If I had sewn starting at this edge, I would have had to remove some stitches to do that. So then after I've done that, I just complete the stitching line.